Hi, I'm Siobhan Ashby and I'm a Senior Financial Advisor at Northeast Wealth.
Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Hello and welcome back to the Australian Finance Podcast. I'm your host, Kate Campbell, and today I am talking to the wonderful Siobhan Ashby. Welcome to the show, Siobhan.
Thanks for having me, Kate. I'm really excited.
Now, this is your first time on the podcast. You're a Senior Financial Advisor at Northeast Wealth.
That's right, yep.
And we're going to talk about childcare, parental leave payments, preparing for kids, which is something you're going through at the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely in the phases of family planning and thinking about that next stage of life and what are the financial implications and how to prepare for that. It's a big deal.
Yeah. Apart from knowing there's a lot to cover and there's a lot to think about, I hadn't ever got into the weeds of what are the different things you can claim and what might you be entitled to until you open my eyes to all of the different payments and systems available. So I thought it was definitely worth having the conversation.
Thank you. I
guess to kick things off, we're talking about household finances. There's a lot to consider. There's a lot of emotions and different decisions involved, and people play different roles in this conversation as well.
Yeah.
How do we start the conversation of thinking about and planning for having kids in a family?
Look, I think the first thing to do is just try and picture your life as parents, which I think everyone would probably underestimate. I'm sure a parent listening to this would say that you can't really imagine exactly what your life is going to be like. But where possible, try and picture the life that you want to have in a family scenario. So what does that look like? How often are you both working? How much time do you have to spend with your little one? I think that having those conversations around what you want your life to look like and how you want your family situation to play out and those values that you're going to hold together as a family, I think that sort of creates the building blocks into then working out a plan for what needs to happen and what sort of things you should be thinking about in terms of structuring your finances to facilitate your family life.
So looking more holistically before jumping into all the specific numbers that might be applicable to you.
Definitely. I mean, it's critical to any sort of financial strategy is goal setting and thinking really broadly about what am I actually trying to achieve here? What's going to suit the child? What's going to suit us as parents? Who wants to be the primary caregiver? Do we both want to work full-time? Do we both want to work part-time? How are we going to do this? And then you start getting into solution mode after that.
You help a lot of families that are planning to take time off work or start families and things like that. Are there any things that really surprise them financially that they weren't expecting?
Children.
Just the sheer cost.
Just the sheer cost of kids. I mean, I think that people really underestimate. That's typically what I see is that people hugely underestimate the cost of children. Nappies, formula potentially, just even Uber Eats so that you get the reprieve of, not having to cook. Babies take up a lot of your time and effort and energy, hopefully mostly in a really joyful way, but it's a complete shift to your life. And I think even just the factor of building inconvenience to your life, whether that's getting a house cleaner or paying for prepackaged meals, those sorts of things, because your time becomes a lot more limited. So I think that people just generally do underestimate the cost of children. And the reality is they only get more expensive as they grow. So, I would think just generally the cost of children is underestimated.
We can't always plan everything in our life exactly, but if we were in the perfect situation where we could plan years in advance for starting a family, when should we start looking into what entitlements we have, how we should structure, who takes time off, that kind of thing?
So I think the best time that you can, or rather the most reasonable time to start planning it is within at least sort of a year or so out where possible. Now, of course, surprises happen. Also, some people are a bit time-bound and don't have the luxury of waiting a year. I appreciate that as well. But realistically, the more time you give yourself to plan for it, the better prepared you can be. But at least if you're a year or so out, you can start to get a sense of what sort of parental leave payments are available, and that although they do change slightly, it's not likely that they're going to change in such a tremendous way that what you're planning for now is not going to be applicable in the future. So I think, at that sort of time frame would probably be ideal.
I want to get into the nitty-gritty of entitlements in a moment, but in addition to that, should people be saving up for having kids as a separate financial goal as well? Should you be putting money aside, maybe, I don't know, $10,000? Like, what do your clients normally do for this?
I love that question.
Because I'm just thinking of it all in terms of goals. Like, I can work for this goal, I can save for Europe.
Look, I absolutely love that question. And of course, as a financial advisor, my answer is yes. Plan separately for your child because, look, to begin with, you might find that costs aren't all that high. Like newborn babies, yes, there's some upfront immediate expenses required to, car seats and prams and the like. Where you might have some additional costs is if you want private health insurance, for example, and to go through the private system. But beyond that, you really do need to start thinking about how your cash flow is likely to change, and also just the additional expenses you're going to have from things like childcare. So the reality is, and unfortunately, a lot of people under-prepare for that and they don't have the savings and the cash flow buffer available. So you get into situations where mum has only had bub 3 months ago, but she's forced to go back to work because parental leave payments have expired, or, they just don't have the savings to facilitate that. And you've got, not even necessarily mum, but a parent who is forced to go back to work and not ready to because they really just want to be the primary caregiver for a while. And so if you can actually set aside money in preparation for that and think very clearly around what are our expenses now, what are they likely to be, let's have a little kitty. When you get into that cash flow deficit at that period where you would ordinarily have to go back, you can start drawing down on that a little bit to sustain you so that you get to spend a bit more time at home with bub. So you really do need to think about if that's important to you, and if it's likely to be, for sure, start saving.
And I guess that if you're planning 12 months out, you have that time to start putting a bit of savings aside for the costs of having the kid, and then putting some money aside if you want to take leave from work beyond what leave entitlements you might be getting.
Absolutely. And I think that the more time you have to plan, the less stressful it is and the less sacrifice you have to make. I mean, fundamentally, I think that people don't really like budgeting because it's not very fun. It's much easier to spend money than it is to save money. And if you're approaching this big, savings goal deadline, the closer you are to it, the harder you have to work to achieve the goal. So if you can give yourself a bit of runway as you're approaching that, you can still enjoy your life. You can still have date nights and you can still go out for brunches or do whatever it is that you like to do with your free money. But at the same time, feel confident that you're working towards this other thing as well.
It's such a vulnerable time for people, taking time off work, lots of changes happening in your life. How do your clients deal with that?
I think to begin with, just some really good communication is just super valuable. Where I see people succeed the most is where they communicate and talk about how they're feeling and how the changes are likely to impact both of them and make a plan together. And I think that where it can fall down a little bit is when you've got expectations that are not the same as your partner's and you're feeling a little bit misaligned, because then when you go to that new experience, it can be quite stressful and you're tired, tensions are high. And so, if you feel prepared for that as best as you can be and you're tackling that as a team, I think that, where possible, that's, going to set you up the most for success.
Okay. So if we get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, what are the parental leave allowances we might be entitled to, and who might fit into those categories?
Currently, you can get up to 20 weeks of paid parental leave pay across your partnership. So essentially, if you're a single parent, you could get the full 20 weeks. But if you're in a partnership, one of the members has to take at least 2 weeks and then the other can take 18. So if you're in a partnership and only one of you intends to get, or rather one of you intends to take time off, you can only get the 18 weeks. And so it just encourages you both to take a little bit of time. Importantly, though, if you are in a partnership and you both want to take time, you can take it however you want. You can take it together. So if you've just had new bub and you're both just wanting to spend a little bit of time together as a new family and adjusting and enjoying the experience, you can do that. You can use it however you want in the first 2 years of the child's life.
So I guess to distinguish this, I know some firms offer paid parental leave as part of the company, and some companies don't, and sometimes it's paid by the government. How do you know how that works?
Well, really, it just depends on the agreement that you have with your employer, and it should be in your employment contract. And I think, importantly, for family planning as well, if you know that you're wanting to start a family within the next few years, thinking about what your employer offers is actually something that's quite important, because employers are obliged to hold your position for you for at least 12 months if you've worked for them for 12 months. So in terms of job security, there is that level of security there in coming back to the employer. However, not all employers are obliged to pay you maternity or paternity leave. Some people are really fortunate that they get that, and that typically happens in larger companies, because the reality is large companies have more money generally, but you really need to understand if that's something that your employer will pay you or not.
So if your employer doesn't pay it, that's when you might be eligible for it from the government.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. And look, you actually still might be eligible for it from the government even if your employer does pay it, because it depends on, so the way that the government assesses it is based on an income test. So, there's a single income test or a household income test. And the single income test is approximately $168,000. The household income test is approximately $350,000. So they're pretty high limits. And what that means, though, importantly, is that if you're on the average Australian income, which is less than $168,000 as a single person, you could likely still get, receive an employer benefit as well as get paid the parental leave pay. And Centrelink doesn't mind how you take it so long as it's taken within the first couple of years. So you might even be using annual leave entitlements, for example, and getting paid from your employer as well as getting paid from Centrelink at the same time. It's quite flexible now, which is really great.
Okay, so some people could get annual leave, they could get their employer paying parental leave, and they also could get the government parental leave allowances.
That's right, yeah.
That could cover you for quite a long time then.
It could, yeah. And importantly, because you get the flexibility in how you want to take it, it means that you could sustain yourself for a longer period of time through work. Like, let's imagine a scenario where you've got a couple of months worth of leave entitlements at work. Even if your employer doesn't specifically offer a maternity or paternity leave payment, you have your own banked up leave entitlements. So you can take those, and if that's enough to sustain you, you can then choose to turn on parental leave after that payment expires and continue on. So yeah, it's actually excellent in the flexibility that it affords families these days.
What type of income are we talking about for the payments you get from the government?
So it's based on the national minimum wage, which is around $176 a day or $880 odd a week. So, these amounts get indexed at the beginning of each financial year. So it really depends on what financial year you're getting paid in. Like, theoretically, if you start your parental leave payments in May, the new financial year kicks off in July. So it's likely that your parental leave payments might actually increase from July because the indexation is applied at that point.
But it still could represent quite a drop in income for many listeners. If they're just getting the government paid parental leave allowances, there might be quite a difference between what they're currently getting paid and what those allowances are.
Absolutely. I'd expect for most it would, because most people, fortunately, are not on the national minimum wage.
Yeah, and that's probably comes back to that planning as part of your goal setting and thinking a year out, that if there is going to be a difference, so understanding what allowances you might be entitled to, you can work out well, what's the difference and do I need to make up that difference somehow?
100%.
Lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And we'll have links in the show notes because I know, as you mentioned, these numbers change and it's worth finding out what's relevant to you when this conversation comes up. So we'll link that in the show notes so everyone can have a look there. What if I'm self-employed or only working part-time?
So it's okay if you're working part-time. Critically, it's more around the length of time you were working for. So to meet the work test, you need to have worked for both 10 of the 13 months before the birth or the adoption of your child and around 1 day a week in that 10-month period. So that's important to consider. The other really important thing to consider is that you must meet the work test as the birth mother or the primary adoption caregiver. And if that, I beg your pardon, and if the second parent or caregiver wants to take parental leave, both they and the birth mother and primary caregiver must meet the work test. So those are the two major things to consider with the parental leave payment is the income test and the work test.
Okay, so it's definitely in your planning for starting a family worth having a look at what the work test is currently and if you meet that.
100%, because it might even be worthwhile to get a part-time job for a few months. That could be the difference between you receiving this payment or not.
Yeah, and the payment's not prorated if you work 1 day or 5 days?
No,
Okay.
It's not. It's just based on once you've met those conditions, you can take the parental leave payment however you like over that first 2 years of the child's life.
What about childcare subsidies? Because that is something that I see a lot of articles on, the cost of childcare. Anna came on the podcast who wrote the book Kids Ain't Cheap and was sharing some of the shocking numbers about how much childcare had been costing her in the past.
It's honestly scary, the price of childcare. It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's more expensive to send a kid to childcare than to pay for yourself for the day.
Yeah, it can be. It honestly can be. And it's generally, I mean, of course, unless you're choosing to send your child to a really great private school from primary age. But when children move from childcare into primary school, it's a huge financial relief for parents. Yeah, childcare is just the cost of it is crazy.
So you see a lot of clients spending and cash flow. Is childcare one of the major expenses there now?
In the tens of thousands of dollars a year, like a massive amount of money, yeah. And critically, childcare is payable on public holidays. If your child's sick, like the days that you have allocated your child to go to childcare, you pay for those days, whether your child goes that day or not. So the cost is just this
locked in cost.
Oh, yes. Unfortunately, that is the case.
So what childcare subsidies might be available for someone listening?
So this was actually a really brilliant increase, which I was very happy to see. So, and importantly, it just gives a lot more flexibility to Australians on higher incomes because even if you're on a higher income, you know, you still have expenses that are probably commensurate to that income. So if you can get a break, that's a good thing. So essentially, the way that it works is that if your income is $80,000 or below, you get a 90% subsidy on your childcare expenses. Now, this has gone all the way up to a household income limit of $530,000 a year, which is actually huge when you think about it. It's a massive amount of income. I mean, if your income is above that, you've got a wonderful problem. So I think that that's going to be okay. So essentially the way that it works is that the childcare subsidy caps out when your household income is at $530,000 and from $80,000 and above, for every $5,000 that the income increases, you lose 1% of the subsidy until it gets down to zero. So it's really a scale of how much childcare subsidy you get depending on where your income sits along that scale. And then if you have a second child, you can get additional subsidies for second children and so on and so forth.
Okay. So at $80,000, what might the subsidy look like?
90% of the cost of the childcare.
Okay. So that's quite substantial.
Yeah, it is.
And that's $80,000 household income.
Yeah, which is not much to live on these days, let's be honest. I mean, the cost of living is just tremendous. And, rental income and mortgages and all those sorts of things. So I'd certainly say it's warranted for people in that situation.
Now, I might be pushing your skills here, but does the parental leave payments get factored into that 80,000 household income?
I would expect so, yes, because it's, again, like the way that Centrelink review income it's from adjusted taxable income. So this is things like what is your employment income, but also what are your investment income, capital gains tax, foreign income, and all these things typically get added to the income side. But then you get deductions on the other side, like investment losses and any applicable offsets. So it's really, I think it would be worthwhile to, like in any individual situation, just go onto the Services Australia website. It's a fantastic resource. It makes it quite clear on how is this calculated? How does this apply to me? What are the, what is the eligibility criteria? Because it's definitely not a one size fits all kind of thing. And it's difficult as well, candidly, to give an answer at a point in time because it can change, of course. So I think it's worthwhile just jumping onto that resource.
Yeah. And I guess if people are thinking about household income, they might not be including income from other investments as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And most people don't, I don't think, because, even if they say, oh, well, my investment, I've got a share portfolio, but I'm reinvesting the income, so I'm not receiving it. It doesn't matter.
People often forget about that bit, don't they?
They do. Yeah. So, but all those things are considered income as far as this calculation can go.
So if you were having a shared household discussion about childcare and who's going to take time off work, or is someone going back part-time, what sort of factors might you look at when trying to work out, is it worth one parent going back, two parents going back, the cost of childcare, how that all plays in?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I think it comes back to that, first of all, that values piece that we were discussing earlier. I see, like, we're in a privileged position in society where there's a lot of different family environments out there, and you can basically do whatever is best for you as your family. I have members where, some mums want to work and chase their careers, sometimes dads do, or sometimes they're both happy to just take a little step back to look after the child. So I think you really need to decide what's going to work best for you, and then so that's step one. Step two is work out what your budget is and be very clear on what are our expenses. How much are we going to need? What is the absolute minimum that we need? And then add a little cream on top of that, because you want to still hopefully be saving. You don't want to find yourself in a financial stress point each month. And then how are we going to do that? Sometimes it just will naturally make more sense because someone is just the clear breadwinner. And so it's financially more responsible for them to continue doing that. But, they might decide that they don't want to be in that position anymore and that they'd rather work less hours or change to a less stressful job so that they can be at home with bubs. So that's okay, so long as you can make sure that you can afford it. So I think that the other thing to do is, if you're considering taking a reduction in your income, be very clear on what that reduction is actually going to look like from a take-home pay perspective. There are some really good websites like taxcalc.com.au or paycalculator.com.au where you can literally just jump on, plug in your income. You can say if that includes super or not, if that includes a help debt or not. So it all gets calculated for you. So you can say, okay, if I'm on X income, this is my take-home pay. And that helps you to really prepare as a family of, okay, if we have these variables come into play, how are we going to do that? How are we going to plan and prepare for it?
Because I often hear the language used, childcare is so expensive, it's not worth me going back to work. And that sort of only looks at the numbers side of things. But there's so many other things we get out of work. We are building our skills, we're building our network, we're growing, we're keeping up, that will help us get jobs down the track that sometimes get lost in that conversation when it comes just to the numbers.
Absolutely. And I think, you made a really good point in terms of the other things that you get from it, even just a sense of fulfillment and, your own well-being of feeling like you have something outside of your family. Some people are happy to be homemakers, and that's wonderful, but others aren't, and that's okay also. I think it's also important, particularly for women, to consider that whilst there is nothing wrong with being a homemaker, you might find yourself in a position where the risk of doing that for a sustained period of time is that if you split up in the future with your partner, and the sad fact is that 50% of marriages are ending in divorce, if that happens, you might have been out of the workforce for so long that you are actually going to really struggle then to step into a position as a single income parent that's going to sustain your household. So as much as that's something that you would not like to think about when you're planning for a child with your partner, it's just important to consider, to future-proof yourself a little bit and to think about, what are the various scenarios that could play out and how can I sort of try and be aware of this and plan for it in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's having those conversations as a household should be about more than just the numbers. They're super important, being able to budget and save up for this goal and taking time off work, but there's all sorts of other things we get from work and taking time off that need to be considered.
Absolutely.
We have covered a lot in this conversation, from parental leave allowances, childcare subsidies, and having this conversation and setting financial goals that mean you can do the things you want when you take time off work. Are there any resources that you're recommending to clients quite often to help them with planning and preparing for all this?
Yeah. So, in the sense of, understanding what your entitlements are and those sorts of things, the Services Australia website is very clear on all of that. Also, if you're wanting to understand what your income is going to look like if you're going to experience a change, going on to taxcalc.com.au or paycalculator.com.au, that will give you a quick calculation. And one of the most important resources that you could possibly have in this situation is a budget. A clear budget planner that very specifically outlines not just what your expenses are, but also helps you to understand your discretionary versus your non-discretionary expenses. And I think that that's important because when you're planning for a potential income reduction, to be able to say, these are my non-discretionary expenses like my bills, my mortgage or my rent or my petrol, my groceries, my child's education fees, those are things that we might be able to change a little bit, but generally we're kind of stuck with them in a sense. Like maybe we can change our mortgage provider or our electricity provider, but those are expenses that we must cover. So once you are able to understand, how much am I spending on sort of lifestyle and nice to haves versus, the essentials, that actually enables you to get a sense of how much you can afford to reduce your income by. So I think having a clear budget planner that helps you to understand and unpack all of that is by far one of the best resources that you could have in this scenario.
We actually have a free budget course created by James from Northeast Wealth that takes you through all of that. And there's a full budget. He's just updated it, which I was updating in the course the other week. So people can download that for free. I'll link to it in the show notes. So if you do want to put a budget together and think about your cash flow and what the next few years will look like, that is available.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone wants to reach out because they're unsure of what to do or how to use it, I'd be happy to have a chat.
Yeah. And this is planning for these sort of big goals is where financial advisors can be really helpful because, as you can see, there's a lot of different things you might be entitled to. There's lots of different things you might need to plan if you want to take time off work, and how does that impact your other financial goals? So talking to someone that's impartial, that's independent, especially in a couple when we often struggle to talk about money within a relationship, can be really helpful.
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely having that level of objectivity can be a benefit because talking about family planning and talking about income are two very emotionally driven conversations. Talking about your career and the career trajectory is an emotionally driven conversation, and it's a really important one to have. But sometimes you might find yourself in a position where either you're butting heads or you don't even want to approach the conversation with your partner and you just bury your head in the sand. But neither one of those situations are going to be effective. And then once the baby's here, you're going to have to deal with it anyway. So I think being able to have someone there that can just talk to you about what the facts are and what your opportunities are in the context of your goals and the thing, and help you to feel on the same page, I think can be super worthwhile for a situation like this.
Wonderful. Well, there are plenty of links in the show notes for today's episode. Siobhan, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Kate. It was really great to be on it.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.